You may think you know all about the origins of the Lego group, but do you know the story of the very first Lego factory that started it all? So wanted to start off with a question. Does anybody know why Billund is located where it is? Why this piece of ground? Where did it come from? So we're going way back to the beginning of the story here. No guesses? That's totally fair. Water. Very good. It's always water. So this is a map. So the Danes are awesome. They save all their old maps and they scan them, which is fantastic. So this is one of the oldest maps that we have of the Billund area. And what we see when we zoom in is this. You see this marshland. And at some point, we don't know exactly when, there's an even older set of maps that shows it not as contained. So at some point, farmers kind of began to channelize what was probably just wet ground, marshland. And they formed it into a tiny stream. And so we channelized it, and you can see here that it's actually kind of a collection of waterways within the area. And you can see that the towns that surround Billund all popped up along these waterways. This is an area where farmers would then use it as a kind of a starting place for their farms. And so naturally these became the places where the craftsmen who would support the farmers would gather, because then they could easily walk out their back door, get water, and go from there. And so this is where Billund and the other towns in the area originated from. And fun fact, if it will click, that waterway is still there. It is what runs behind the Lego house today. That is the original stream. It's obviously been changed in terms of its location and such, but that stream is the beginning point of this whole story. So this is a map from 1851. And so this shows you kind of what Billund looked like at that time. It was truly just a collection of farm roads that kind of met at this juncture where there was a crossing of the stream that they had made. And so that is where it all originated. You can begin to see that there are a few little, parcels here that are beginning to form. This is where the craftsmen lived. And then you can see it's not quite the standard, what they call the Danish star pattern, where often you would have these little gathering places and then the farms would shoot off from there in like a star. But here it's a little bit different because they just kind of follow the stream. But you can see there are these huge, long, narrow parcels. And the reason they would do that is often these streams is also where they would get their irrigation water. And so you would make little channels and ditches off of these streams, run them along your property line, and that is how you would support your farm. And so this, just to give you a little bit of orientation, Lego house sits right there today. Literally in the center of the town from the very beginning, which is pretty cool. So that takes us, so again, this was 1851. The way that these maps work is they would draw a map and kind of lay out all the parcels. That was what these were for. They were to keep track of who owned what as they went along. And then they would make markings and changes. And so now, and then when it would get too messy, when too many lots had been subdivided and sold, or they'd crossed out too many things, then they would start over and draw the map as it was right then and then go from there. And so that's what we see here. So you can see all these little markings. And what I want to draw your attention to is this area right here. So this is the next map after the last one that I just showed you. This one began in 1903. And you can see, so just a little bit of the nomenclature, when something was no longer there, they would cross it out. And so this is a little bit of conjecture because obviously no one wrote it down at the time. But what we believe happened is that there was this farm road, and just like how if there's a sidewalk that kind of goes a little bit around and then there's naturally that little dirt path, people started saying, well, I don't want to walk all the way around to get up to there. I'm just going to go straight. And so they formed this little farm road. And so when Stefan, who is the gentleman who owned the original Billund woodworking shop before Ole Kirk, when he went to get a lot subdivided for his property, they said, well, we'll just use that farm road in this lot line. And so we got this weird triangle lot. The Lego system begins with the Lego story begins with the creation of lot 5F, as it is labeled here. That lot and that crazy triangle is still with us today. So if you've ever walked in front of Innovation House and wondered, why in the world is there this weird, narrow little section with all these pointy houses? It's because farmers were lazy 100 years ago. That's why that shape is there today. So we had the creation of this lot, and that is really where this story begins. So before Systemvej, there was the original factory. So this photo is from Billund, a postcard from 1910. Why there was a postcard of Billund in 1910, we have no idea, but we're grateful that someone thought to make it. Because they stood in exactly the right spot. Because here we can see the original house and one-story workshop. This is what it would have looked like as far as we know when Ole Kirk purchased it in 1916. And again, I know that's kind of crazy how housing, it gets more expensive through the years. So if you do the math, so he bought it in 1916 for 10,000 kroner, which is the equivalent, if you do inflation and all of that, to 232,000 kroner today, which is $36,000 in USD or 28,000 GBP. So amazing what you can get when you don't have to have electricity and all this other stuff in the house. So anyway, this is Billund in 1910. So this is what it looked like. And just to give you orientation, this is basically as far as I could kind of pace it out if you were standing right here, looking towards, the Lego house here, Innovation House, etc. So this is Billund, back at the beginning of the Lego Group's story. So one thing that's really cool about that, so first of all, as a complete aside, these photos are from 1924, and we know that, well, I'll get to why we know that in just a second, but how in the world were there aerial photos of Billund in 1924? As best as I can tell from having looked into it, the best guess we have is the Danes adopted airplanes as a way to do agricultural surveys very, very early. And so our best guess is that these are photos from an agricultural survey. But what's really cool about it is this is the bridge and the waterway that is such an important part of the story. And you can see the irrigation ditches coming off the side. This photo is taken as if you were basically right over the original house. This is, so after Ole Kirk purchased it, he added a second story. So this was his original shop. This is what it looked like when he first began his woodworking business there in the early 1920s after having purchased it. And then we also know a little bit about his neighbors. So there was an existing house right next to him. It was two different, it was kind of divided. So it was a barber and a watchmaker. So he did not have far to go to get his haircut, if need be. And then the truly crazy thing about this picture, and why we know the date of it exactly, is by sheer coincidence, the house and the workshop are missing. And that is because they burned down in 1924. So by sheer happenstance, someone flew a plane over Billund right in the interim before he had rebuilt after the fire, which allows us to date exactly when this happened. So that's a really, horrible coincidence for him, but very cool coincidence for us all these years later. So after that fire, that is when he built the famous lion house that is still standing there today. And this was kind of the interim factory. So this is what he built, and at that time they called it the workshop. And so this was his home, the lion house here. You can see some of the early sketches, the famous lions. And this is what they constructed. A couple of rooms and very kind of a simple structure. And then, of course, that's what the house looked like when it was under construction there in the early 1920s. And so it's here we reached its kind of the really interesting turning point in the Lego Group's story. So for those of you who know some of the basics of your Lego history, the Depression hit Denmark very, very hard. And that was when Ole Kirk, kind of turned and began transitioning from being more of what we think is like a carpenter or even a contractor building larger structures, and larger wood things made out of wood, to selling this small toys. And we always hear that, he went and knocked on doors and sold them door to door. And it's kind of hard to separate that image from what Billund looks like today, right? It's still pretty small, but you kind of think, oh yeah, there were plenty of doors to knock on. This is what Billund looked like in 1935. So this is exactly what it would have been like when he went and started selling his toys. And as you can see, so here's Billund. And what's really cool is here's that triangular lot. So we've got his house and the second workshop there. And they've even, again, this is why we think it was another part of the reason we think it was tied to agricultural surveys. You can see here they've marked all the tilled land. So they've flagged Ole Kirk's beloved kitchen garden in his backyard, which we will come back to in a few minutes. So at this time, this was all that Billund was. I mean, this was a tiny little town that had this little workshop making toys in the Depression. And zooming out, so this is the larger map that comes from. So we were just zoomed in on this section. So this is just to give you a perspective. When we say he went door to door, that was what that looked like. And again, I have no way of knowing which ones of these. I just marked every building I could see on this map. So some of them were homes, some of them were probably barns and other, agricultural related things. And so there's no, this is miles and miles and miles of walking in the middle of nowhere, to try to sell his things door to door. So it really just kind of puts it in perspective, what it was like when he started this company and began selling the toys. And what toys was he selling? This is what would have been made in that original factory before the Systemvej factory. So again, we can see the transition that's happening here. Most of you have probably seen this photo. It's a very famous photo, but some of the earliest toys, but then also some of the housewares that they sold during the Depression. The famous wooden duck would have been manufactured in its earliest stages in this factory, along with the yo-yos that were their first big hit there in when that craze kind of swept across Denmark. So, for anyone who knows a little bit about this story, you all kind of know what's coming next. So they went along in that factory that was built in 1924 all the way till 1942 when disaster struck. And that was when we had the big fire that happened in 1942. And this was a comprehensive fire. It gutted the original factory, burned all of the internal sections, which were made of wood. And then you can also see that just destroyed so much of this, the superstructure that it just made, a lot of the brick and walls and such just unusable. So one cool thing about this is if you go back to some of the older sources, there was originally, there's contradicting information as to whether or not the warehouse burned down along with the house. Some sources say it did, some sources say it didn't. But we can clearly see in this photo, and especially this next one, the warehouse is still there. So we can, if anyone was wondering and that was keeping you up at night, the warehouse made it. And again, warehouse, I don't know if it's a translation thing. This was actually where they stored the raw lumber because at that time when you cut wood down, it was often very wet. And so you would store it and let it dry for several years actually before you would then take it out and use it. And so that's what this was used for. And so this is it. This is Systemvej under construction. And you can see fire was probably a little bit of a traumatic thing for them. So you can see here they are making it out of concrete. And we actually think this wall may have even been like an early proto-firewall because you can see it sticking up through the roof of the factory in later images, much like a firewall would today. So definitely did not want that one to burn down, and they succeeded because it never did, and is still with us today. So this is the first official, what we think of as the first official Lego factory, because this is ultimately where the first bricks will be made. And so this is it. This is a photo, again, an aerial photo. Very good angle, so thank you to the pilot and the photographer back in 1943. This is what the original Systemvej Lego factory looked like. We also have some on-the-ground photos, which is kind of cool. We're starting to get that. So you can see it joined to the original lion house through this kind of covered connector. This is Systemvej here. It's more or less in the same location it was today. We can see Ole Kirk's neighbors are still here. They've got their lot here. Ole's got his formal garden here, which is still there today. You can stroll through it if you want. He was very proud of that. He loved his formal garden. And then his kitchen garden stretches up this way. And what you can see is this was truly the edge of town. Like this was just kind of the end of it. There was nothing beyond but farms for as far as you could see. Again, Billund was very, very small at this point, but all that was about to start changing. So just one more view of that that first factory. We believe this is Ole Kirk proudly standing in his formal garden, but we're not sure because it's just so grainy. Zoom in and it just becomes a blob. But yeah, so this was what the Systemvej factory looked like right after it was first constructed. We believe this picture was 1943. And again, just to kind of place it. These are the types of toys that they made then. So again, we're all wooden toys at this point when this factory first opened up. It was completely tooled for wooden toys. That was all the machinery. And they were starting to make, bigger, more painting is being done on the toys. You can compare it to that last picture where often it was just stained and varnished. And now we're starting to do kind of these detailed paintings. And we're starting to do a little more branding. The Lego logo and name is starting to show up on a bunch of these different products. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm just kind of walk you through and show you how the town and the factory really kind of formed this symbiotic relationship and grew together, and in some cases kind of got in each other's way, which is kind of funny. So we're looking here at Systemvej 2.0. So again, aerial photos, bless them. No idea why, but we've got tons of aerial photos, which is awesome. So here we can already see, so this photo is from the late 1940s. Again, the dating of these early ones kills the historian within me that I can't give you an exact date. So we think sometime in the late 40s. We have a few things that can place it, but not perfectly. So, but again, here you can really just see you can see that triangle. And this was all Ole Kirk's. So this is where, their kitchen garden where they got a lot of food. He had his greenhouse. And there was just a real mix at this time of kind of stuff that was for the factory, kind of the business side, and the personal side. It was all just kind of mixed together. So like he's got his garden sheds back here. This is that warehouse, again, that survived the fire. And but the biggest thing is we've added this huge new lumber warehouse for drying the wood. So this is the second piece of land. So this is the first expansion beyond that original triangular property that Ole Kirk bought back in 1916. And it is where the parking garage for the Lego house now sits. So that you can, again, begin to kind of see the modern shape of Billund taking place here. There is, and then this is what does allow us to place it a little bit. So we know that there was a military base over in the nearby town of Vandel that sold a barracks to Ole Kirk in 1946. And it stumped us for a long time because it is brick in all of the on-the-ground pictures. So we believe what happened is that he bought a wooden superstructure, and then they did a masonry wall finish around it to kind of make it match everything else. But it was definitely this building, which he connected to the old warehouse. So again, we have bits and pieces, pictures, old promotional videos. Amazingly, they had old promotional videos at this time. In terms of, it's hard to determine what the internal layout was. As far as we can tell, they were switching it all the time for what they needed, etc. So when he built this, they converted this and added this. And the factory's gotten a crow's nest. That becomes important later. And what's cool about this era of the factory, this kind of 2.0 expansion, is they actually shot a promotional video. If you've been in the basement of the Lego house, this plays sometimes on one of the screens. So if you were there 2 years ago and there was a weird guy standing there with his phone like this for the entire thing, it was so I could grab these little screenshots and pin them all together. So this is that expansion, the barracks from Vandel. And it just shows a lot of cool angles. So this is now that alleyway that sits between the Lego Idea House and the parking garage. So there's a bunch of shops and stuff over here. So this used to just be a cobbled track. There's actually this, you can kind of see it here. This is this double door. And there was actually an old loading dock, and there's parts of this video where this horse-drawn carriage pulls up and they open it up and load it as if it was a semi-truck today. It's really funny. And then there was another small little expansion out the back of the factory. So yeah, there you go, right there. You can see the horse-drawn carriage coming up to the double doors. And that's where Systemvej is now. So this is, if you were standing out in front, this is that watchmaker's shop there. So this was the street in front. So you can see it's starting to grow. We're starting to get more formal. Things are, now the sidewalk that was in front of Ole Kirk's house has been expanded and lots of things. So the town is starting to grow up. And what's also cool about this is that from this we know there used to be, we're not sure if it was a shop or a showroom, but there was the front left part of the house. This door is now bricked in, but that was where they displayed a bunch of the different products that were for sale at the time. And from that we can kind of know, because you can see them on the shelves, these are some of the products that were built in the factory at this time. And then there's also a really cool shot in this where you're kind of standing on the street, kind of looking down this way. And so I tried to recreate that photo the other day. So endangered life and limb to stand in the middle of the street. Busy Billund with all of its cars whizzing around. So, which then brings us to Systemvej 3.0. And this is kind of the mystery expansion. We have very few photos of it, but you can clearly see it here. The factory has been extended so that it joins to that. We think it was probably just a matter of convenience. That used to be the lumber warehouse, and so they would just send people out with hand carts to just bring in the wood you needed at the beginning of the day, and it was fine. But when you're starting to use it now as part of the factory process, having it joined to the factory just makes sense. And so we think that that's probably what it was. Just a couple other things you can just see. Again, they're growing. And this really just is kind of emblematic of what happened over the next 20 years as they just kept being more successful than they were expecting to be. And so they just were constantly needing more space. And so there wasn't any sort of master plan for either the factory or the town. And as we'll see in a little bit, they begin to get in each other's way. You can already begin to see it here that we're kind of starting, there. Ole Kirk built a new shed for his garden because they took his old one and made it part of the factory. How rude of them. So he got this nice new big one on the back of his property next to his beloved greenhouse. The group took that one from him later too. Eventually we have a drawing where it shows it as part of the facility. But you can see that we've got now multiple new houses. The entire side of Systemvej across from the factory is now built out with homes, which is going to become a problem in a couple of years. But the neighbors still own their little wedge-shaped lot, so we've still got the watchmaker and barber and watchmaker here in the front. There definitely wasn't any zoning back in Billund back then. We just built factories in backyards. But Ole Kirk wanted a bigger garden, and so he talked the watchmaker and the barber into selling him portion of their backyard. So this is him. The soil in this part of Denmark is really terrible, and so in order to get anything to grow there, he had to bring in all of this sod and such. And you can see right there, that's one of the best pictures we have of this expansion. So again, it really just looks like it was a matter of convenience. The company was growing and all of that. But a very important time in the company's history because these products would have been made in this iteration of the factory. So we're starting to get the plastic toys, and of course then the first automatic binding bricks. And I give you the original Lego goat from way back in the day. So, had to throw that one in when I found it.
If you're enjoying Daniel's fascinating presentation on the original Lego factory, then go over to blocksmag.com and order the Blocks Book of Retro Lego Sets Volume 3. There's a written version of this content in there, with many of the images that you're seeing on the slides, printed in a high-quality magazine packed with other content focused on retro Lego sets.
So, but this is also just a really cool illustrative product of what they were starting to do. In the early days of plastic, they used it to supplement the wood products and add to them. So obviously they were selling individual plastic products, the baby rattles and stuff like that. But the bigger use of it was to kind of add, it would be very hard to make something like that out of wood and give it any sort of detail. But with a plastic molding machine, you can. And so they would use it to enhance these, lovely wood toys that they had. Also one of the earliest Lego base plates. All right, so that brings us to the early 1950s and Ole Kirk's big expansion. So this was probably not the wisest idea, but he called for an absolutely monstrous new expansion to the factory. Fun fact, Godfred quit in protest over this for 1 week and before he came back. But here, this is just such a great picture because you can see, obviously we've got the huge expansion that Ole Kirk basically came in and he said, your job is to find the money to, do whatever I want. And we've also you're starting to see these roadways, starting to grow around the town. So again, this was an old dirt farm track, kind of one of those legacy ones from back in the day, like we were looking at earlier. That's now, being much more formalized. It's running through. We're starting to get more houses. And we're starting to get, it forms right here, the first parking lots. People are starting to come from longer distances. They're starting to drive. Very few. Most of them still lived in the area and would just walk to work. But we're starting to just see the town is growing. And again, you just think back to that picture from earlier where it was the edge of town. Well, now the edge of town is way out here. And this growth is all being driven by the needs of the Lego group, as they're just needing employees to run the machines that fill these crazy factory expansions that they're doing. And then we've got the lot, and part of the reason for this as well was to make it easier for people to get to work, the people who lived along this roadway. So we've now got the sidewalk, and that is where the sidewalk still is today. If you come into the Lego Idea House to its front entrance, you walk up that exact path. Probably not the exact concrete, but the exact path. And then again, there's all these little expansions. Basically everywhere where they could poke out a building, they were poking out a building. Because again, wood at this time still would have been the driving factor until the Ferguson tractor began to switch that over. And so this is just a slightly different angle of the same time period. You can see the expansion is still going on there. And then this is just to illustrate again, more and more houses. You compare that, this was all just completely empty. This is completely built out. Ole Kirk's still holding on to his garden, but not for long. Again, the town is growing. And again, just a kind of a cool thing, we're starting to get structures that are still there. These houses still exist along Ole Kirksvej. And maybe some of them are still owned by Lego group employees. Again, this is when we would have gotten into the Lego Marshland and just other products. Again, we're starting to continue to mix plastic, rubber, and wood all together into the same product. So as hey, there we go. I wish I'd thought of that. Yes, the earliest GBC. There we go. I'm going to add that in when I give this at a later time. So, okay, so that then brings us to Systemvej 5.0. So this is where we get into just the explosive growth of the Lego group as we, obviously get to the point where we're at the system in play. So this is what this next iteration of the factory looked like. So you can see there's Ole Kirk's big expansion. So the first thing is that we've joined the original factory over to his expansion. So again, this is where that little warehouse that survived the 1924 fire, well, it finally met its end and was replaced by just an expansion of the factory in the same style with the proper 2 stories with the brick and all of that. For some reason they changed the windows. Not sure why. Some of these windows, though, the original ones were ones that Ole Kirk had intended to be used for other things back in the day. The arched ones on the other side of it, you could see them in one of the old pictures, was actually for a dairy that never got built. And so he just incorporated them into the factory to save money. And then we've knocked down some roofs here because at this point we're hemmed in. There is nowhere for this to really grow. We're hemmed in on all sides. Houses here, houses along here. This was all privately owned and was being built out with houses. We've got new roadways. It's just the town is slowly growing along with the Lego group. That's been joined so they don't have to walk outside anymore because again, at this point, presumably this was no longer being used purely for wood storage. So this is now a building that people are having to go in and out of just as the course of the normal factory, production and daily schedules. And then again, we've got this big landscaped area. Ole Kirk really loved this area, so trees and fencing and looked very nice like it does today. And this is still pretty much the extent of that grassy area in front of the Lego Idea House to the side there. And then again, we've got some cool photos where we've got some on-the-ground views from this period. So we can see again the expansions to the factory. Expansions to the factory, and then this is that. They redid that poor barracks from vandals so many times in terms of roofs and windows and cutting doors and changing windows. You can see they bricked them in here. I guess they were already trying to get a little secretive, not be able to walk down the roadway and see what was happening. Who knows? Which then, of course, brings us to the Lego system in play. And what's really cool about this is the original internal announcement that was kind of informing the employees and some of the sales staff and all of that about, hey, here's what the system in play is, here's how you market it, here's what it's, the vision for it is. And they included a little, hand-done painting or drawing of the factory at that time. And you can see it's exactly what we just showed. And you can see, they did take Ole Kirk's little shed back there. So it was now officially part of the Lego factory. And yeah, so this is what it would have looked like when they first started making the system in play sets there in the early 1950s, mid 1950s. All right, which then brings us to the 6th iteration. So at this point, we are hemmed in and running out of room. And this is just kind of cool. You can see in these photos, because of the windows are distinctive, we can place where these are. So this is the 2nd story of what we were just looking at. So that was where they used to pack the Lego boxes. In a later photo, we'll see that they changed it into a showroom. So they were constantly, moving stuff around as the needs arose and switching how different rooms and sections of the factory were used. So at this point, we couldn't go out anymore, so we went up. And this is, so again, they basically just built a 2nd story and just filled in the entire space. So we've got a 2nd story added to the roof there, and the gap has been filled in, so we're just adding houses and houses. This is the first Lego garage, as far as we know, where they parked the original branded Lego trucks. So they were parked off of Højmarksvej up there. And again, we said earlier, no zoning. So the poor watchmaker and barber just keep getting more and more stuff built towards the back of their house, changing the view out of the back there. Which, though, at that point, again, as you can see here, there's nowhere else to go other than Kirk's garden, which, of course, we all know they didn't do. And so at this point, we are going to make a break for it. So this is, going back to the maps, maybe, there we go. So this is the next iteration of maps. And so you can see here in blue, this is what the Lego group owned at this time. So the main, what was left of the triangular lot. So again, we can see it here. There's all those subdivisions that are now those houses across from Innovation House. This is where the garage sat. This was what was originally the lumber storage. And so what they're trying to do is get over here, right? We want to get over into this where we've got finally some room to grow. And so the way that they did that is they purchased 2 home lots and knocked the houses down. And then they purchased this large tract of land that was sitting behind them. They would eventually go on to, this became GKC's house where the Teddy Bear Museum is now. So that was acquired by GKC. So when you hear, if you talk to some designers who were there when GKC, was still working for the company, they would talk about, oh yeah, we would go over to Godfred's house after dinner, and sit around his table and design sets. It was not like, when I first heard that, I was like, oh wow, that's real commitment, going out to the boss's house after work. It was right there. So still very cool, but not literally a stone's throw away. And then eventually the company would also acquire kind of the rest of this lot so that they could fill in and put administrative buildings and such, as we'll see in a minute. And so with this picture, we can kind of see, I'm not sure how this is going to show up in the light, but you can kind of see, I've tried to put a modern day picture, the modern footprint and shape of the company's operations in this area are beginning to form. So you can see Innovation House here will ultimately sit where all these homes once were, and they're adding buildings on this lot, these sets of lots that they would purchase and then eventually combine into a single property. And so this is what it looked like. So you can see here, those houses have been knocked down. We're clearing the property. We've added a Lego sign to the building, and we've purchased those 2 lots over to the side, and it's for what is going to be Systemvej East on the other side of the road. And we've also now purchased even more of the neighbor's lot to put the system house, which was going to be the first formal administrative office, which is also now part of the Lego Idea House complex. And again, we got some on the ground, and we know this was before 1960 for reasons that will become apparent in a moment, because the crow's nest is still there. But there's clearing and such here. This is, again, where that neighbor's house is kind of sitting over here. They're just, again, growing in all directions. And this gives us a nice little visual. So this is the blueprint for the expansion, but they nicely drew out all of the different things that were owned by the company at that time, so we can kind of immediately mark what those were. And these lines are what we think. So this right here, these first 2 rectangles, that's the original factory. And this line here is part of the reason we believe there may have been that kind of formal firewall because they show it as almost as if it was a separate structure, which is kind of how you do that. Which then brings us to the big expansion, and we mean big expansion. So they jumped across the road. Again, really ruined the neighbors' views, but we've got the huge Systemvej East campus here, and almost as soon as they finished it, they had to keep building. So we can see here they've already building the next expansion to the factory, even further beyond it. And you can just see that this was what they were trying to get to, right? So there's the expansion. Even further work, and then obviously they're trying to get to open land so that they can have enough space to grow. And you can also see the first iteration of the system house. So this used to be the headquarters of the Lego group right here, this little building. And now we have completely ruined the view for the poor barber and watchmaker, their little white house there. So, yeah. And I guess, yes, and they're still adding on to that building in the back. So just, again, every square inch or square meter of property that they could get their hands on. And then we can also see that the town, right, is growing even further north up Systemvej. Most of these homes would have been Lego employees that got up in the morning and just walked down the road to work. Because the only parking that we've been able to identify is a couple of spots right back behind here. So at this point, again, the town of Billund is completely dependent on the Lego group for everything. And then just kind of a little bit of a fun fact. So this is GKC's original house before he built his big one over here. And for anyone who knows their Lego history, I'm going to probably not get the pronunciation right here. But Hans Scheiss, who was the original molding expert that GKC hired from Switzerland to come. He made it a stipulation of his contract that he had to move to Billund. And so he lived in this house. And that is also why we eventually got a huge Lego presence in Switzerland throughout the 70s and 80s, because he wanted to go home. And after, I think it was 10 years, he moved back to Switzerland and they set up a factory there, and it was because he didn't want to live here anymore. And so that was what the factory looked like at that point. Okay, so if you will indulge me for a moment, because if there's any crowd that might be able to help me solve this mystery, this is the crowd. There is this little ancillary building that gets built right here. It's roughly where part of the Dagny home building is now. And this building has driven me crazy for a year. Every other building I can identify it, I can know what it's for and all of that. But this darn little building, so this is every picture I have of it, and you can see it is the weirdest little building. It's all these independent rooms that each have their own door to the outside. So it's almost like it was like today we would say it would be like a storage unit. It's completely separate from the factory, but has this giant trench that connects it to the factory.
And the housing for workers?
It has no windows. So it would be awful housing if it was, that was a thought I had. I was like, well, maybe these are like little dormitories. Yes?
Could it be like that they, before the trucks came to pick up the stuff, they would like preload the stuff in the different things? So one room was for one truck to be loaded.
Like a loading dock? Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't think so, because it was landscaped in front of it later, and there was just a little sidewalk to it. So like it was separate from the factory. You wouldn't be able to back a truck up to it, or any vehicle for that matter. So if anyone one more guess, yes?
Electricity coming into the factory?
Like a power equipment or switch gear or something, maybe? Yeah. If anyone comes up with a guess later, email me. Secret research. There we go. The original product development. Yeah. Yeah. There we go. So, all right. Well, I even asked the corporate historians, and they didn't have a guess either. Yeah. Well, one more.
Which year?
Which year? So this would have been. It shows up. This was around 1958, 1960, somewhere in there. It would have happened. So anyway, if anyone has a guess later on my mystery building, email me, because I'd love to figure this one out. So after all that, so this is where Systemvej, the original Lego factory, achieves its maximum form. We are now to the point where, so this photo is from 1962. And this is where the original Lego factory reached its zenith. So as you can see, here we go. Oh, but first, so 1960, we had the final fire. And so people have often heard of this fire. And again, that lovely firewall, the fire stopped right there. So kudos to whoever built this back in the day. So this is the fire that you hear about. This is the one that ceased production of wooden toys. So up till this point, they had still been working on wooden toys. But this really kind of gives a little bit of perspective because it ended up being pretty much just the wooden toy production area that burned. And so here you can see, and again, now that you kind of know the extent of the factory at this point, it was like a quarter of the second floor of the old building. So really this was, they were a plastic toy company at this point. This was basically almost like a legacy operation that was up here on the second floor. And after this, GKC, Godfrey Kirk, who was Ole Kirk's son, who was running the company at this point, basically said, that's it. We're not going to rebuild and put, whatever equipment was up there for wooden toy making back. We're just going to move on with plastic. The Lego brick is our bread and butter. That's what's driving the growth of the town. That's what's driving the growth of the company. But this is the photo from right after that fire showing the extent of the damage. And so the crow's nest that I mentioned earlier, that's how we can date before and after 1960 very easily, because the crow's nest did get burned down because it was on the wrong side of the firewall. And you can see right there, that's the little extension up, and that's right where the fire stopped. So.
Do you know if there's any indication that they were planning to abandon the wooden?
Not that I know of, but I mean, again, at this point, it was so small that it was kind of, and several of the other brothers were very passionate about the wooden toy production. So there was probably that it was as much a passion project at that point. And as long as you're selling it and it's still making money. And now they had this big old extension off the other side. So, yes.
What were the barber and watchmaker doing? If they had a motive.
You're not wrong. That's right. A little bit of arson in Billund back in the 1960. There we go. Unsolved mysteries. We now know who started the fire. And so this is just, again, just kind of getting a closer look at what was going on at the time. So this is at this point, again, we're an international company. The company has grown to the point where there are people traveling to Billund to see the products, to partner with the Lego Group to sell their wares in different countries. And so they needed the huge showroom. And so when we start talking about, what kind of eventually led to Legoland, the models, the model shop, the things that they were building, this is where it began. So this is actually kind of cool because that photo I showed you earlier of them packing sets, this is that same space that they've now repurposed and is also kind of close to where the vault is today. So kind of a cool full circle thing with the company. So yeah, we know this is right there again because they changed the window shape. So it's very gratifying that you all appreciate all this detective work, like the oohs and ahs, because my family thought I was crazy poring over these images over the last year. So very gratifying. Thank you. So. And so here we go. So this is it. This is Systemvej, the original Lego factory at its biggest. So again, we can see you've got over here, this is the original factory. Again, they did it apparently in different shingles, or it's just weathered differently, so we can just see all these nice little things. Ole Kirk's big expansion, the full old lumber warehouse, all of its expansions out the back and over to the side. The huge 1953 expansion, the expansion to that. And then they added this enormous finished product export warehouse. So if you bought Lego products sometime in the 1960s or even the 1970s, it probably sat in here for a little bit of time before it came to you. And just like today, no windows, so that there wouldn't be damage from sunlight, etc. This building was allocated to Modulex for a time. So there was Modulex production. We believe there was actual production there, but they also moved out pretty early on. But we have old employee maps that show the complex, and they're all hatched to show which parts of the company operated in different places. And that one is marked as Modulex on one of those. So this was it at its biggest. And then the other thing you start to see after this point is parking begins to become a major consideration for the company. So at this point, again, and you can see it over here, Billund as built out. We filled in all the pieces of land, all the pieces of property. All the walking distance parcels have been purchased and built on. And so people are starting to drive in. So they originally just kind of used it haphazardly as just, park wherever you need to, out in the back. And so this was the extent of it. And then just kind of one more look. So this is kind of at the same time period, looking a little bit further down. And we can see back here, so some of you may know the story that Ole Kirk at one point purchased a large parcel. We can see it on the old maps. We know where it was. And he subdivided it, put drainage in, and made it available to employees as a kind of a thank you to those who had been with him and helped him build this amazingly huge company in the middle of this tiny little town. And so this is the property. And what the company would do is that they would sell the lot to the employee at a very reasonable price. And then the company would actually co-sign the loan and guarantee the loan for its employees for the houses. They all apparently used the same architect because those houses are still there. And many of them are still occupied by Lego employees, from what I have been told. So here we can see all of those little houses. Again, now a lot of them have been added onto and they look a little bit different, but originally they all just kind of did these little cookie cutter homes. And this is those properties. So just a very, very cool legacy of the company that, again, and then helped Billund to grow. All right. And so then these are the kind of the products, the last of the products that would have been produced at Systemvej. The first wheels, Modulex, the first Lego train, and then just some of these early, models with instructions would all have been made here. And so this is just then in terms of the impact of success. So here you can just see this is what Billund looked like right at the end of Systemvej being the primary Lego factory. You can see all the homes up there. But the image that really tells the tale is this one. So this is the population of Billund here. And, for some reason that is cut off. I don't know why it's not showing the dates down here, but this is 1960 right here. So Lego System in Play, right there. And you can just see the exponential growth. So again, the town, this was all driven by the Lego group. This is 1930 right here. And so then just boom, all of this exponential growth after the Lego System in Play. So some of you might be wondering, after all of that and being such an important part of the company, what happened to Systemvej afterwards? So over the next few years, they built out the rest of the parcel. So again, here now we've got formal parking lots. And there was this weird dome structure that was there for a while. We think it was for just storing materials for construction. But the real thing that changed everything for Systemvej was the Højmarksvej factory. I probably got the pronunciation wrong, but this is the major Lego factory that was built to the north. Kind of humorous after having watched all those years of growth and them having to expand the factory and keep going and building and building. Godfred was so relieved when they finally built this huge factory. In his opening speech when he opened the factory, he said, "At last, we have all the space we will ever need." And humorously, of course, as everyone here knows, they were building monstrous new factories just a few years later in other parts of town. But this was the factory that just replaced pretty much the entire need for Systemvej. They, again, instead of having it spread across all these haphazard buildings that had been joined in a haphazard way, they were able to, do a completely modern facility, which just then made Systemvej redundant as a production facility. But of course, it lived on. Much of it is still there today. So the first thing that we see is in the early 1970s, they demolished Ole Kirk's 1953 expansion and then that big warehouse for the raw lumber storage that had been there for all those years and turned it into parking. Parking is kind of a theme here that we have. For a period of time, actually in the 1980s, the Lego Group actually rented parts of the complex out, especially the System House portion with its administrative offices. It was a bank for a little while. And that's what you can see here. And then it was also the Billund Post Office for a little while was in Systemvej. And then in the late 1990s, they actually kind of came back and rebuilt some things in the 1953 expansion area. That's how it is today. And then they made major changes to the old factory, the expansion on the east. Again, it was kind of the early before Innovation House. A lot of the design work and other things were done there. Again, major changes, but the rough shape and form of it is still there. And it was roughly in around the year 2000 that it achieved its kind of current form as we see it today. And just so kind of just give you a comparison, this is kind of a modern aerial photo, and you can see that building is still there, that one is still there, and that expansion and the Modulex area is still there. Just if anyone's interested more, I'm writing a whole bunch more about this in the future issues of Blocks magazine. So if this interested you at all, I will go into a lot more detail. Definitely pick those up if this interested you. And with that, I think I have a couple of minutes for questions if anyone has any. Yes?
So what happened to the watchmaker and the barber?
The whole part of the story. The Lego Group eventually just bought the buildings when they passed away. So the later I didn't focus on System House. So that first one that was kind of right behind that property, eventually the Lego Group acquired both their operations after they passed away.
You could see in some of the area photos.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So they built the.
When was it?
So that would have been, I don't remember the date right off the top of my head, because the original System House was 1958, so it would have been in the 1960s that they did that. And yeah, that building is still there. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering about the street name Systemvej.
Oh,
because,
yes, I meant to say that,
I would
yes.
guess that it was only named that after they coined that phrase system in play.
You are
So
correct.
it would have had another name before.
Yes, so we don't, at least I don't, and no one I've been able to talk to or sources I've been able to see knows what it was before. So if there's anyone in here who happens to know what Systemvej was, but yes, so it was Godfrey eventually, and we're actually not sure if it was the road first or the factory first, because until the new factory was built, the big one that I just showed you, it was just the Lego factory, in the same way that, World War I was the Great War, back before you needed names for a second one. So
Way means way or street,
yes,
right?
so he wanted to rename it.
Street name initially, I would guess.
Yeah, so it was named in honor of the system in play.
Yeah.
And so, and the Lego Group likes to name its factories after the road or field that fronts it. And so, yeah, so eventually they named it after the system in play, and the road and the factory were given that name after the fact. So, yes?
While you were researching the architectural changes and structural changes, did you also get a chance to talk to any people, the townspeople whose lives were shaped, both for good or for bad, for how the town just became Lego?
Yeah, oh, that's a great question. Unfortunately not. So I have asked around a little bit, but the folks who were there when a lot of this was happening are very elderly at this point. And so I haven't been able to really connect. I have made some inquiries, but haven't been able to find anyone who could really walk me through, oh yeah, I was there, I remember when this was added. That would be a very cool addition to this. I would love to do it sometime. Yeah. I think everyone in this room would like to know the watchmaker and the barber's opinion. So, any other questions? Yeah.
How long have you been researching to get to this story?
So I bet.
About months, years?
So I've had the privilege of writing about Lego history now for about 5 years. This particular project has been about a year. It was a complete rabbit hole project. Graham, my editor, asked me to do a very simple task. He asked me, so if someone goes to Billund for the first time, write a quick little thing about, the 3 things they should make sure to see. And I was like, oh, well, I was like, what is the oldest part of that factory building? And it was a complete rabbit hole from there. So, but yeah, so for this particular research project, specifically about a year. So with that, I'll take one more question.
For those of us who live in Billund, are there any hidden gems or ruins from yesterday's Billund that you might be able to find?
I only really know the kind of the factory and this. So I do know maybe one kind of cool one. The Lego house parking garage that sits on that pavilion is actually reused the bricks from the factory that replaced Systemvej. So they knocked down most of it. There's like a third of it that they left that now is support facilities for Legoland. And the rest of it, they took some of the bricks and used it to make that parking, the outside facade of the parking garage. So that's the closest I can give you. So, well, thank you very much, everybody. Really appreciate your time. And yeah, thank you.
What's your email if we need to find something for you?
Oh, yeah.